The raw, jagged edges of betrayal tore through me, leaving me feeling hollowed out and adrift. Her sobs, her apologies, her pleas for forgiveness, they were just echoes of the past, a broken record playing the same tired tune. This time, the music held no comfort, no solace. I didn't yell. I didn't rage. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, empty ache. I simply looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a stranger in the eyes of the woman I had loved for 22 years. "It's over," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The sobs subsided, replaced by a stunned silence. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're done," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I can't do this again. I can't live with this constant betrayal." The dam of her emotions broke, and the tears flowed freely, but this time, I felt no sympathy, no desire to comfort her. The well of my compassion had run dry. The next few weeks were a blur of packing boxes, hushed phone calls, and tearful conversations with our children, explaining the unexplainable, trying to shield them from the sharp edges of our broken marriage, was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Our son, already navigating the complexities of early adulthood, absorbed the news with a quiet stoicism that belied his age. Our daughters, however, were devastated, their teenage world rocked by the seismic shift in their family. The divorce was messy, protracted, and emotionally draining. The lawyers, the mediators, the endless paperwork, it all felt like a cruel joke, a final insult to the life we had built together. She fought for everything: the house, the cars, the alimony. It was as if she was trying to erase the past, to rewrite the narrative of our marriage, to paint herself as the victim. But I wouldn't let her. I fought back, not for the material possessions, but for the truth, for the acknowledgement of the pain she had caused, for the years of my life she had stolen with her lies and deceit. In the end, we reached a settlement, a compromise that left us both feeling bruised and battered. I moved out of our family home, the place where we had raised our children, the place where we had shared so many memories, both joyful and heartbreaking. The silence of my new apartment was deafening, a stark contrast to the familiar symphony of family life I had left behind. The months that followed were difficult. The loneliness, the grief, the anger, they came in waves, threatening to drown me in their intensity. I leaned on my friends, my family, my therapist, their support a lifeline in the turbulent waters of my new reality. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to rebuild my life, brick by fragile brick. I reconnected with old friends, took up new hobbies, and focused on my work, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of my career. And as the seasons changed and the sharp edges of my grief began to soften, I realized that while the tower of my marriage had crumbled, I was still standing, stronger, perhaps, than I had ever been. The future was uncertain, but I faced it with a newfound sense of resilience, a quiet confidence that I could weather any storm, knowing that even in the ruins of loss, there was always the possibility of new beginnings, of new dreams waiting to be built. The issue of location sharing bothered me. It felt insignificant, yet it symbolized the delicate trust we had painstakingly rebuilt after the events of 9/11. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, I decided to address the situation. "Darling," I started, trying to maintain a steady voice, "I noticed you disabled location sharing earlier. Is everything all right?" She glanced up from her novel, her face deliberately neutral. "Oh, that. My phone's battery has been depleting rapidly recently, and I read that location services can be a major drain." Her explanation seemed reasonable, but the knot in my stomach remained. "Right?" I responded, attempting a casual tone. "Just checking in. You know, after everything." A flicker of emotion crossed her features, a brief glimpse of the shared guilt and pain we had both endured for so long. "I know," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I would never." Her words faded, leaving the thought hanging in the air. The subsequent days were tense. I found myself observing her closely, scrutinizing each movement, every text message, each phone call. I understood this compulsive need for reassurance was unhealthy, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that something was amiss. The specter of 9/11, coupled with her near infidelity, continued to haunt me, a constant reminder of our past vulnerability. Then came the business trip, a conference in Chicago. She was scheduled to be away for 3 days. I saw her off at the airport, forcing a smile and wishing her a pleasant trip. However, as I watched her depart, that nagging feeling intensified into a cold dread. That night, Sleep evaded me. I tossed and turned, plagued by visions of hotel rooms and hushed conversations. Eventually, at 3 a.m., I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I opened the Find My iPhone application. The pulsating dot indicating her phone's location was stationary, but not in Chicago. It was located in a small, unfamiliar town a few hours outside the city. My heart raced, and a terrible realization began to form. The battery excuse, the unfinished sentence, the sudden aloofness. The pieces fell into place. It felt like history was repeating itself. I immediately reserved a flight out of New York, consumed by a torrent of anger, betrayal, and a profound sense of loss. This time, there wouldn't be a national crisis to intervene, to offer us another opportunity. This time, the foundation of our marriage felt as if it was about to collapse. Driven by a need for clarity and reassurance, I began exploring ways to access my wife's phone, computer, and other devices, hoping to understand the situation that was putting a strain on our relationship. One day, we needed to take our youngest daughter to the post office for her passport application. My wife, who works at our daughter's school, offered to drive her, and I met them there. We both needed to be present, but throughout the process, she seemed distant and preoccupied. An uncomfortable silence filled the car as we waited, punctuated only by her frequent phone calls. It was evident she was communicating with someone, fueling my anxiety and desire to check her phone for peace of mind. She used to leave her phone unattended at home, but now it was constantly with her, further adding to my unease. I also remembered her recent iPad purchase for work, which I had set up. We discussed it extensively beforehand, so the purchase itself wasn't a surprise. Like her phone, the iPad became a constant companion, carried around the house. At one point, she left it unguarded on the table, presenting an opportunity. To my surprise, it was locked with a passcode, unusual for us. Her explanation, confidential student data, seemed reasonable, but the possibility of other uses lingered. On Friday, we met at the bank to finalize our new house loan. Afterward, she mentioned running errands. Curious, I checked our bank account and noticed a transaction from an adult store. Suspicions immediately arose. Later, I discreetly checked her purchases and found elegant lingerie. Our intimate life had stagnated, largely due to her diminished desire. This discovery prompted a difficult conversation. Frustrated by our lack of intimacy, I started researching low libido in women. This led me to observe her behavior more closely. Eventually, I figured out her iPad passcode. With a mix of caution and resolve, I accessed the device and discovered a Facebook message from a stranger requesting a picture. They weren't Facebook friends, which was odd. It could have been random, but her reaction suggested otherwise. The conversation was surprisingly open, and when he suggested she leave our daughter and be with him, I impulsively decided to confront her that evening. This was a mistake. She denied everything and took swift action to conceal the affair. She claimed the lingerie was for me, a way to rekindle our intimacy. The Facebook messenger was supposedly a former summer job colleague who had randomly contacted her. She insisted their communication was purely textual, with no physical involvement. While I wanted to believe her, I struggled to accept her explanations. I made it clear that everything needed to stop immediately, and she agreed. The following day, I asked if the affair was truly over, and she assured me it was. She was unaware I'd seen their messages through other means. I discovered she'd told him to unfriend her on Facebook because of my ultimatum, meaning she'd lied. And here I am, 19 years later, facing a chillingly familiar scenario. My emotions are turbulent, and I feel lost. My appetite is gone. Sleep eludes me, and concentration is a struggle. To cope, I've scheduled therapy sessions for later this week and increased my gym visits. This situation is agonizing, and I wish I could avoid it. Since uncovering the truth, I've been reading Psalm 81 almost daily. For a few days, I managed to handle things relatively well, but today has been particularly difficult. Last night's sleep deprivation exacerbated my emotional distress. On a positive note, our son, born before the first affair, surprised us with tickets to a performance he's working on at a local theater. We attended the play, Come From Away. We put on a happy facade, appreciating his unexpected gift. He's an exceptional young man in his early 20s, and we didn't want to disappoint him with a refusal or lack of enthusiasm. For those unfamiliar with the production, it centers around the events of September 11, 2001. The date carries a heavy significance, as did my feelings when we received the tickets. Constant reminders of that specific date and time, combined with a freshly reopened emotional wound, prevented me from fully engaging with the performance. Under different circumstances, in a different setting, I might have enjoyed the outing, but from the start, I longed to be anywhere else. To manage my discomfort, I began journaling, documenting dates, times, and thoughts. I even developed a personal mantra: stay calm, stay patient, stay in control. I need to be more consistent in applying it, but I'm diligently working on that. I've made considerable progress in reframing my thinking. Now, as we prepare for our evening shopping trip, I'm determined to shift my perspective on the situation brought to light by my investigation. It turns out her interactions with other men occurred during a summer school program where she worked as a teacher's assistant. She connected with a physical education teacher who is 32 years old, while my wife, who behaved inappropriately, is 47. This situation could be described as her embracing a cougar role. He teaches physical education at a nearby school, while my wife works at a different school, not even in the same district. They crossed paths during this summer program, which draws teachers and staff from various districts. This unique environment allows individuals with diverse educational backgrounds to collaborate who wouldn't normally interact professionally. I knew he'd be in the program but kept that knowledge to myself. She remains oblivious to my awareness. I began observing their interactions more closely and eventually found a message from her to him on Facebook with intriguing content. To my surprise, he seemed dismissive, which I admit made me smile. It led me to believe he viewed her more as a friend, wanting to avoid romance given their age gap. She's 47, about 15 years his senior. This assumption stems from earlier messages where she mentioned an overnight camping trip, and he didn't respond. I later learned she told him about it. We've had some family discussions, but she doesn't seem to share my perspective. However, I haven't made a final decision, though I sense it's approaching. With significant life changes looming, I feel it's vital to establish a robust information network. I'm utilizing tools like voice recorders, GPS trackers, electronic access codes, and so forth. My aim is to gather substantial evidence before taking any decisive action. I'm also diligently researching divorce laws in my state. Eventually, I'll consult legal professionals for guidance. I've sought advice from recently divorced friends, and their insights will undoubtedly be invaluable. I've also decided to DNA test my 3 children, not out of doubt, but for my own peace of mind. Regardless of the outcome, my love for them remains unwavering. What am I waiting for? A combination of sufficient evidence and the courage to confront the reality of our situation. The realization that our marriage is irreparable is growing stronger, and I know I must face it. Confronting this harsh truth remains daunting. Furthermore, I'm deeply reluctant to expose my children, even though they're older, to the upheaval of divorce. Their well-being and emotional stability are paramount. Until the situation clarifies, I find myself in a strange position, deriving a morbid satisfaction from listening to her dictaphone-recorded conversations. It keeps me informed of recent developments, like her unfriending numerous people over the past few days. Yes, I admit to spying, which understandably upset her. I realize my actions aren't commendable, but it's important to note she's been experiencing what I perceive as a midlife crisis for the past year or so. She also lost her mother in November, deeply impacting her emotional state and compounding our already difficult circumstances. Just 2 days later, my father passed away. Within 3 weeks, we lost 2 more relatives. Amidst this grief, Christmas arrived, bringing further misfortune and sorrow. I understand the profound effect these losses have had on her. A thought lingers. Perhaps her current state is a consequence of these recent events, and maybe I should try to separate the pain of these losses from the additional trauma of divorce. I'm willing to make that sacrifice for the well-being of my children and loved ones. I've made the difficult decision to exercise patience a little longer before acting rashly. Ending a 26-year marriage is complex, especially considering the profound love I felt for this woman for much of our time together, a love that often felt all-consuming. I can't deny the strength of those emotions. I plan to spend this week researching divorce attorneys, but my daughter's birthday is next Sunday, so I've decided to speak with her afterward. While I'm unsure of the exact words, I intend to inform her that I'll be actively seeking legal counsel by then. Hopefully, I'll have retained a suitable attorney and be prepared to initiate proceedings. A small part of me still hopes for a moment of realization and reflection on her part. I've reached the point where I no longer wish to continue the marriage, given the compelling evidence I've gathered of her infidelity. On February 11, 2022, I discreetly placed a voice recorder in her car. Listening to the recordings has provided valuable insight into the aftermath of the incident. I've chosen to mentally prepare for potential repercussions that may soon arise. To combat insomnia, I've resorted to sleep aids for a restful night. I've also channeled my nervous energy into resuming my gym routine. Regarding my diminished appetite, I intend to shed some extra weight gain during my training hiatus. To address concentration issues, I've started meticulously noting down vital information and mentally rehearsing the steps of everyday tasks I might forget. Lastly, I've been experiencing night sweats and am actively seeking solutions. When I uncovered these events, I quickly recognized another aspect requiring attention. I gathered towels, t-shirts, and underwear, placing them beside the bed. I anticipated managing these things, particularly during the cold winter months, could be challenging. After this initial response, a sense of relief washed over me. I no longer needed to constantly conceal myself, playing the spy or investigator in my own marriage. I wouldn't have to tiptoe around sensitive subjects to avoid upsetting her before I could even voice my concerns. I understood that in recent months, she'd been acting as if everything was normal, which only fueled her frustration when I finally confronted her. Receiving a box of her deceased mother's belongings from her father was a significant event, yet I felt strangely detached. Observing her reaction during our subsequent argument didn't evoke any sympathy or sadness. After persistent questioning, she finally asked, "What's wrong? Tell me what's bothering you." I simply said his name. I watched her excitement as she rushed out of the house. In that moment, a burden lifted. I no longer felt anxious about her presence, or pressured to meet expectations, or constantly update her on my activities. Regarding recent events, something felt off. Everything was going too smoothly, almost unnaturally so. Her unexpected kindness aroused suspicion. Things that typically irritated her suddenly didn't. Initially, I perceived it as newfound happiness, but unease lingered, prompting me to become a vigilant observer. Like a detective in metaphorical sunglasses and a raincoat, I discreetly placed a voice recorder in her car and activated the GPS, casting my metaphorical fishing line. Astonishingly, I caught something on the first try. The recording captured two phone calls. The first indicated her intention to meet him. Their rendezvous occurred in a church parking lot, lasting roughly 40 minutes. Thankfully, I was spared hearing their conversation as she walked to his car. She then called her trusted friend across the country, her confidant. If speaking to him wasn't enough confirmation, which it was, this call provided further evidence. But if I truly wanted to remain oblivious, then her call to him would have been the deciding factor. Our subsequent conversation followed her typical pattern. She minimized or denied her involvement, shifting blame. It's apparently my fault she resents missed opportunities before our marriage, college, a carefree single life. Regrettably, I accept responsibility for this, and she holds some resentment. I've told her that if she wants to end the marriage, I'll understand. Yet she chooses to stay, making it clear the betrayal is her choice. While I acknowledge my shortcomings as a husband, I wasn't married to a perfect person either. The notion of having an ideal wife seems unearned in my case. Consequently, I've contacted divorced female acquaintances for lawyer recommendations and strategic advice. I've realized it's time to end this. My wife, emotionally withdrawn from our relationship, has shown no commitment to reconciliation. I'm unwilling to risk further betrayals. Therefore, I'm leaning towards divorce. Are there any specific tips or techniques I should be aware of during this process? I'm still overwhelmed by emotions. In a moment of intense frustration, I punched a wall, thankfully causing no harm to myself or the structure. In the empty house, I unleashed pent-up emotions, shouting a curse word. Thankfully, no one witnessed it. During a vulnerable moment, I broke down in tears while speaking with my best friend. In that state, I entertained fantasies of a beautiful reconciliation, hoping everything would magically mend. I wondered if it would be so terrible if, with a little more effort on my part, we could salvage our relationship and she could find happiness. However, deep down, I know these are false hopes, and divorce is the correct path. I've reiterated this to my mother and friends. I've confided in myself countless times since the discovery of her betrayal. We've largely avoided each other, and I acutely feel her absence during those times. Changing our dynamic has been incredibly difficult. We used to exchange texts throughout the workday, checking in, sharing updates, engaging in light banter. Casual hugs and kisses were commonplace. But now, back at home, all that has vanished. As mentioned, we actively avoid each other within the house. She's taken to sleeping on the couch. One of my simple morning joys was gently waking her. I'd roll over, caress her back or arm, and softly whisper, "Hey honey, it's time." Sadly, those intimate moments are gone. Every morning, I'd wake her with a gentle touch and a near-silent whisper that always brought a smile to my face. Despite everything, she hasn't left, and we haven't officially separated, but deep down, I know what must be done. Though the journey will be arduous, I find comfort in the hope of a glimmer of light at the end of this dark and lonely tunnel. It's painful to witness her envy of our children's opportunities, travel, exciting events through their school musical group. Neither of us had these experiences growing up. I find joy in their happiness and the chances they have, which I didn't. For 2 decades, I've played in a fairly well-known local band, performing at some wonderful events. Yet, my wife resents these opportunities. She dismisses the countless hours of practice and study I invested to reach a level where I could pursue this passion. Ironically, she often relays stories about people she encounters at work who've heard or follow our music. She seems to take pride in being married to someone who attracts attention. One day, she complained that I abandoned her with the children when I went to play. However, I worked and brought home a paycheck. While I enjoyed performing, there's no denying the exhilaration of playing music for an audience. I had to manage gig arrangements, liaise with bar owners, maintain impeccable rhythm, and read the crowd. Despite the fatigue from late-night performances, I'd still wake up at 5 a.m. for a full day's work. It made for long, demanding days, but it was necessary. We needed the income to build the house she wanted. Leaving the band wasn't an option. It was a significant income source. She had her own job, but my performance earnings rivaled her steady income. Furthermore, she resented that my primary job paid 3 to 4 times her salary. I strived to provide my family with the life I felt they deserved. Yet, instead of gratitude, I received resentment. The saying, "When someone shows you who they are, believe them," rings true. Sadly, it took me far too long to understand the true nature of the woman I married. Therefore, I've reached the same conclusion. Remaining together would mean perpetuating a cycle of frustration and discontent. I've gathered recommendations for several lawyers and will be scheduling consultations soon. I see no viable solution or future for our relationship. Divorce might not be immediate, but it's clear there's no foundation for reconciliation. Paradoxically, those who know her outside our home view her as a wonderful person, a warm, caring, exceptional mother, always helping others. And she genuinely fulfills those roles. But within our family dynamic, things are different. She exhibits the traits I described earlier. It appears she's fallen victim to what I call the Palm syndrome. This individual, her coworker, is, as it turns out, married to another coworker. I haven't informed her family yet. As far as I know, her father and his sister are her only remaining relatives, though I don't communicate with them frequently. I plan to inform her father eventually. I also reached out to the other man's wife, but she hasn't responded. If I don't hear back, I'll send another email in a few days with more details, then respect her decision if she chooses not to engage. Tonight, I finally mustered the courage to tell my wife I want a divorce. The hugs, the tears, the bedtime intimacy, all gone. Thankfully, she understood the gravity of the situation. We had a bittersweet conversation, reminiscing about how we wished things were different. Summoning my courage, I asked the difficult question, "Did you not consider this outcome when you made this choice?" She admitted she had, but she was still devastated. It's painful to witness her suffering. Despite my deep love for this woman, I've realized I can't continue the marriage. It's a choice I don't want to make, but it's necessary. I believe I'll find peace in no longer being tied to her. Our band is currently on hiatus, but I'm actively pursuing other musical opportunities, focusing on classic rock with brass elements, like Chicago. I look forward to the day when this difficult path leads to strength and stability. I anticipate challenges, but am confident in my ability to emerge positively. While she mentioned counseling and reconciliation, I firmly shut that down, recommending therapy for her own well-being. At this point, I only feel responsible for not ending the relationship sooner. I haven't committed any other wrongs in recent years. On the contrary, I've strived to be a devoted husband, prioritizing her above all else. Despite my best efforts, I find myself here. I'm often torn between wanting to save the marriage and remembering why it's no longer possible. This sadness reinforces my readiness to move forward. Although I initially emailed the other betrayed spouse and received no reply, following advice, I mustered the courage to call and share the truth. I've never felt so terrible, even knowing I did nothing wrong in conveying the information she deserved. Witnessing her heartbreak, I felt responsible for her pain. It was like reliving the shock and devastation all over again. Breaking someone's heart, even unintentionally, is incredibly difficult. I assured her that, though we'd never met, I'd be there for her via phone or text. Our conversation proved therapeutic for me as well. After discussing our experiences, I have a clearer understanding. She expressed gratitude, reaffirming that I made the right decision. Despite the conversation's difficulty, I was genuinely interested in her perspective on his behavior. It seemed she may have fabricated an unhappy marriage narrative to gain sympathy and establish a closer connection with him. While I acknowledge her role in this situation, it's possible she manipulated him by playing to his desires. My wife remains unaware of this development. I rejected a man involved in infidelity, resulting in 2 families shattered and 6 children left wondering why their parents inflicted such pain. Perhaps comparing salaries would be illuminating, but it didn't occur to me at the time. I've ceased communication with my wife and avoid being in the same room unless it involves our children or household tasks. A distinct coldness has settled over our home. She seems to be slowly realizing she's crossed a line. I'm taking steps to protect myself, seeking legal counsel, leaning on friends, planning my next move. She doesn't seem to fully grasp the situation's gravity. To create distance, I limit our conversations to essential matters: house, kids, finances. I prefer not to share her company. She's beginning to understand the seriousness, but seems to expect me to either ignore it or desperately try to salvage the marriage. In the past, I failed to assert my needs and desire to stay together, settling for apologies and minimal change. I regret my previous passivity, but I'm taking a different approach now. My behavior has changed completely. Casual conversations and small talk are gone. She seems to struggle with my detachment, which is disheartening. She doesn't realize the responsibility for our marital problems rests solely on her shoulders. I understand I may never get an answer to the question of why. That question lingers. Despite everything, tonight was a good night. We attended my youngest daughter's school musical performance as a family. My wonderful daughter had a prominent role and delivered a fantastic performance. Watching her sing, dance, and embrace every moment on stage was heartwarming. My wife sat beside my mother, who's aware of our situation. While my wife doesn't know what my mother knows, I couldn't help but feel for my mom, who must have been in an uncomfortable position. When I finally told her the truth, she was genuinely shocked. She remarked on how happy we always seemed and how much she loved my wife like a daughter. Another betrayed spouse texted me during the performance, checking on me. Her husband, the other man involved, had been temporarily banished by his wife and sought refuge with a friend who, it turned out, wasn't home. This raised concerns about potential impropriety. I was relieved to reassure her that her fears were unfounded. However, I'm still plagued by painful memories and obsessive thoughts. Despite hoping for reconciliation and a way to mend our relationship, I'm increasingly certain divorce is the most logical course of action. I understand that under these circumstances, this might seem premature or uncertain, but continuing this relationship feels utterly impossible. The only logical option now appears to be divorce. While I occasionally yearn to salvage our shattered life and family, those moments of nostalgia and hope are fleeting. They're part of the healing process, but they quickly fade, replaced by the stark reality that staying with her isn't worth it. I see this shift as progress because it makes me question why she, a seemingly normal person raised in a devout Christian household, would engage in such reprehensible behavior, violating the principles and moral boundaries instilled in her since childhood. Tonight was a turning point. I followed her to a parking lot where she lingered for a while, then went to a store and returned to the lot. Observing from a distance, I wondered what was happening. My intuition told me she was with him, prompting further investigation. To my shock, I discovered her car parked next to his. In the process of confirming the situation, I contacted his wife, with whom I'd been communicating. She encouraged me to approach them, introduce myself, and take a photo as evidence. Following her advice, I asked my wife not to come home that evening, and I drove home alone. She called, crying and apologizing. Reluctantly, I agreed to retrieve my belongings, hoping she would leave for a while. This is how I finally got my answers, and a new chapter in this tumultuous journey began. However, there was an unexpected twist. The DNA test results for my 3 children sat untouched in our mailbox. Since I rarely receive physical mail, I'd forgotten about them. I'd always believed all 3 were mine, but to my astonishment, the results revealed my eldest son wasn't biologically mine. This revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. I hadn't anticipated this betrayal. Realizing she must have been unfaithful in the early years of our marriage shattered my heart into a million pieces. I knew I needed to be honest with my children, even if it meant delivering devastating news. Last night, I told my son the truth. It was an emotionally charged moment filled with embraces and tears. Meanwhile, my soon-to-be ex-wife was still absent after I'd caught her with her lover. Though he's not my biological son, I raised him as my own, and he holds a special place in my heart. In his 20s, he's become a wonderful young man any father would be proud of. However, he's not yet ready to confront his mother. With a heavy heart, I made the difficult decision to inform my soon-to-be ex-wife. I called her, gathered my strength, and revealed the truth. As expected, she broke down in tears and apologized. She wanted to come home, but I firmly advised her to stay away for now. Regardless of the DNA results, I reassured myself he is still my son. Our bond transcends biology. Throughout this ordeal, I never hid my love for the children, reminding them of it daily. Now that the truth is out, I feel a sense of relief. The constant worry, the role-playing of a marital detective, the concern over her actions, it's over. This marks a new chapter free from deceit and uncertainty. I can finally release this burden and breathe easier. The days of tiptoeing around her, the constant tension, are behind me. My children and I have begun the healing process, and while it won't be easy, we've found a measure of peace amidst the chaos. In the days, weeks, and months ahead, we'll undoubtedly experience a range of emotions, but I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. Then, the most tragic event imaginable occurred. Even though we were all angry with my soon-to-be ex-wife, we were consumed by grief when we learned of her death in a car accident caused by brake failure. Our world shattered. Initially, it seemed accidental, but later, surveillance footage revealed that her lover's wife had intentionally sabotaged the brake lines while my wife was at their house with her lover and his friend. The other wife had broken into the garage and committed this act. She couldn't forgive their transgressions. Her involvement in my wife's death was confirmed, and she received an 8-year prison sentence. Coping with this devastating loss, along with my children, is an incredibly difficult journey. Life throws unexpected blows, but the key is to persevere and learn from the experience.